Imagine being so certain about something that you willingly leave behind everyone you've ever loved, your parents, your siblings, your best friend, every memory that you've ever made. Not because someone forced you and not because you were threatened, but because you truly believed that you were about to go somewhere better. Now, imagine putting on identical black clothing, packing a small overnight bag, taking the same mixture of medication as everyone around you, lying down beside people that you've come to think of as family, and believing that in just a few minutes, your soul would leave your body and board a spacecraft hidden behind a comet. It sounds impossible, right? Like something only crazy people would believe. Except 39 intelligent adults did exactly that. On March 26, 1997, police entered a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, after receiving an anonymous tip. Inside, they found 39 bodies, and the scene was almost surreal. Each person wore the same black shirt and black sweatpants. Each wore the same brand new pair of black and white Nike Decades. Purple cloths had been carefully placed over each person's face. Their belongings had been neatly packed, almost as if they were preparing for a trip. Because in their minds, they were. They didn't believe they were dying. They believed they were graduating. Today, we're going to tell the story of Heaven's Gate. But more importantly, we're going to explore how ordinary people came to believe something extraordinary. Because the uncomfortable truth isn't that they were fundamentally different from us. It's that the psychological processes that brought them there exist inside every human being, including you. Welcome back to The Human Pattern. I'm Liv. Every week, we explore the hidden psychology behind the choices people make, the beliefs they hold, and the patterns that quietly shape human behavior. Sometimes those patterns show up in relationships. Sometimes they show up in crime. Sometimes they show up in everyday life. And sometimes they lead 39 people to willingly end their own lives because they believed a spaceship was waiting for them beyond a comet. When most people hear the word cult, they immediately picture brainwashing. They picture weak-minded people, people who weren't smart enough to know better. But psychology tells a much different story. Most people don't wake up one morning and decide to join a cult. Instead, they take one small step, then another, until one day they're standing somewhere they never imagined they'd be. Today's episode isn't just about Heaven's Gate. It's about certainty. It's about belonging. It's about identity. And it's about one of the most fascinating questions that there is in psychology. How do ordinary people come to believe extraordinary things? Before we dive in, if you're enjoying The Human Pattern and you're curious about why people do the things they do, I'd love to have you here every week. So take a second to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It really helps the show grow and make sure you don't miss future episodes. All right, let's get into it. To understand Heaven's Gate, we first have to understand the world it was born into. It's easy to look back nearly 30 years later and think, how could anyone possibly believe something like this? But if we only judge the ending, we miss everything that came before it. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a time of enormous change. The Vietnam War had shaken Americans' trust in the government. The civil rights movement had transformed the country. The counterculture movement encouraged people to question authority, reject tradition, and search for new ways of understanding the world. For many people, the answers they had grown up with really no longer felt satisfying. So they started looking elsewhere. Interest in meditation, Eastern religions, astrology, physics, reincarnation, and spiritual awakening really exploded. Bookstores filled entire sections with books promising hidden knowledge about the universe. Seminars teaching higher consciousness became increasingly popular. People weren't just looking for information, They were looking for meaning. And at the same time, another fascination was sweeping across America: space. In 1969, humans had walked on the moon. What had once seemed impossible suddenly felt achievable. Science fiction became more popular than ever. Movies and television imagined civilization beyond Earth. Reports of UFO sightings appeared across the country. Some people dismissed them. Others became convinced that they weren't alone. And looking back, some of these beliefs might sound strange, but every generation has ideas that feel completely reasonable in the moment and confusing decades later. The important thing isn't whether beliefs were true. It's that millions of ordinary people were asking the same kinds of questions. Why are we here? Is there more to life than what we see? What happens after we die? Could intelligent life exist somewhere else in the universe? Whenever people are searching for answers, someone eventually comes along claiming to have them. And in the early 1970s, two people believed that they had found those answers. One was a former music professor struggling to make sense of his life, and the other was a nurse with a deep interest in astrology, spirituality, and the mystical. Their names were Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. At first glance, they seemed like two ordinary people whose paths happened to cross at just the right moment. But sometimes history doesn't begin with a grand event. Sometimes it begins with a single conversation between two people who become convinced they've discovered a truth that no one else can see. Marshall Applewhite wasn't born believing that he was an alien messenger. In fact, if you had met him in his earlier life, you probably would have described him as intelligent, charismatic, and deeply passionate about music. Born in 1931, Marshall grew up in Texas in a religious household. His father was a Presbyterian minister, and faith was woven into nearly every part of his upbringing. From an early age, Marshall seemed destined for a respectable life. He studied music, became a professor, and was known as someone who genuinely cared about his students. On paper, his life looked successful. But beneath the surface, things were becoming increasingly complicated. Marshall struggled with his identity for so much of his adult life. He wrestled with questions about purpose, belonging, and who he was supposed to be. Some historians believe his internal conflict was intensified by the fact that he was a gay man living in a time and environment where that part of himself was deeply at odds with his religious upbringing and societal expectations. While we can never really fully know what was happening inside his mind, it's clear that he was searching for something that could reconcile the conflict that he felt. Over time, his career began to unravel. His marriage ended. He lost his teaching position. The life he had spent years building was slipping away. And when people experience repeated losses, it's common for them to begin searching for a new story about who they are. A story that explains why everything happened. A story that gives suffering a purpose. And Marshall was searching for that story. Around the same time, Bonnie Nettles was searching too. Bonnie was a registered nurse, married, and a mother of 4. Unlike Marshall, her interests leaned heavily towards astrology, mysticism, and spiritual exploration. She believed that there was meaning hidden beneath everyday life, that the universe communicated through signs, that there were deeper truths waiting to be uncovered. In 1972, Marshall and Bonnie met at a hospital in Houston, Texas. Exactly how they met has been told in many different ways over the years. And some accounts say Marshall was visiting the hospital. Others suggest that he was actually receiving treatment. But what most historians agree on is that the connection between them was immediate. Almost instantly, they began spending enormous amounts of time together. They talked for hours: religion, philosophy, life after death, the nature of the universe. why they both felt different from everyone else around them. The more they talked, the more convinced they became that their meeting wasn't a coincidence. It was a destiny. Bonnie introduced Marshall to ideas about astrology and spiritual awakening. Marshall brought his religion background and natural charisma. Together, they began weaving those ideas into something entirely new. And before long, they had convinced themselves that they weren't ordinary people. They believed that they had been chosen for a special mission. At first, that mission wasn't to start a cult. It was simply to share what they believed was the truth. They began traveling across the country, speaking to small groups of curious people. They didn't promise money. They didn't promise fame. They didn't promise success. They promised answers. Answers to life's biggest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? Where are we going? For people who felt lost, lonely, or disconnected from the world around them, those weren't just interesting questions. They were deeply personal ones. And when someone appears to have certainty in the middle of your uncertainty, that certainty can be incredibly attractive. Marshall and Bonnie didn't begin with hundreds of followers. They began with conversations. One person became two, two became five, five became 20. Slowly, almost quietly, a movement was beginning to take shape. And before they could convince others to dedicate their lives to this movement, they first had to give those people something powerful enough to believe in and a completely new way of understanding reality. As Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles traveled the country, their message became more detailed, more specific, and far more extraordinary. At the center of everything was one simple idea. Human beings weren't the highest form of life. According to Marshall and Bonnie, there was another level of existence beyond Earth, and they called it the next level. The next level wasn't heaven in the traditional Christian sense. It wasn't simply life after death. It was a real, physical place inhabited by highly evolved beings who had transcended what it meant to be human. These beings weren't angels. They weren't gods. They were, in their minds, extraterrestrial beings who had evolved far beyond us. And humanity, they believed, had the opportunity to join them, but only if they were willing to leave behind everything that made them human. According to their teachings, our bodies weren't who we really were. They were simply vehicles, temporary containers. And the real self was something spiritual, something capable of continuing long after the body had served its purpose. That idea became one of the most important foundations of Heaven's Gate. Because if your body is only a vehicle, leaving it behind doesn't feel like death. It feels like stepping out of an old car. Marshall eventually began referring to himself as Doe, and Bonnie became T. Together, they claimed they had been sent from the next level to prepare a small group of people for humanity's next evolutionary step. Their followers weren't supposed to worship them. They were supposed to learn from them, to become them. But there was a catch. The next level required complete transformation. Followers were expected to detach themselves from nearly everything that connected them to ordinary human life. Families, friendships, romantic relationships, money, careers, personal ambitions, even their own identities. The logic was simple. If your goal is to become something entirely new, then you can't keep clinging to your old life. As the group grew, their daily lives became increasingly structured. They lived communally, they dressed similarly, they followed strict routines, they avoided anything that might strengthen emotional attachments to the outside world. Many members even gave up their birth names. Instead, they adopted new names ending in "adi." It was a symbolic way of leaving behind the identity that they believed belonged to their human selves. One of the most striking aspects of Human's Gate was its view of human desires. Things most of us see as completely normal. romantic love, sex, personal achievement, individual expression. The group saw those as obstacles. They believed these desires kept people trapped at the human level. Some members even chose voluntary celibacy. Several male members, including Marshall Applewhite himself, underwent voluntary surgical castration as an expression of their commitment to overcoming earthly desires. To outsiders, these practices seemed shocking. Inside the group, they represented progress. Every sacrifice was viewed as another step towards the next level. And perhaps that's the most important belief of all, that the earth itself wasn't permanent. Marshall taught that humanity was approaching the end of an era. The planet would eventually be recycled. Those who weren't prepared would be left behind. Only those who had completed their transformation would move on to the next level. If that sounds familiar, it's because versions of this idea have appeared throughout human history. Religions have long spoken of final judgments. Many cultures have believed in the end of the world. Countless groups have predicted humanity's last days. Heaven's Gate wasn't built from completely new ideas. It was built by combining familiar ideas into a completely new framework. And for the people who believed it, that framework answered almost every question they had ever asked. Who am I? Why do I feel different? What happens after I die? Why does suffering exist? What is my purpose? The more questions it answered, the more convincing it became. And before long, believing wasn't enough. The teachings had to become a way of life. As Heaven's Gate grew, something subtle began to happen. The group wasn't changing what people believed, it was changing who they believed they were. When most of us think about joining a group, we picture adding something to our lives. A new hobby, a new church, a new friend group. But groups like Heaven's Gate don't simply add another piece to your identity. Over time, they begin to replace it. The people who joined Heaven's Gate didn't all fit one stereotype. Some were highly educated. Some came from stable families. Some had careers. Others were searching for direction after difficult periods in their lives. What many of them shared wasn't a lack of intelligence. It was a desire for purpose, for certainty, for belonging. As they became more involved, the outside world slowly became less important. Many members left their jobs. Some gave away their possessions. Others limited or completely stopped contact with family and friends. The people they once relied on for perspective were no longer part of their daily lives. Instead, their entire world became the group. Their routines reflected that commitment. They lived together, worked together, ate together, made decisions together. Even the language they used began to change. Words shape the way we think, and Heaven's Gate had its own vocabulary. Their bodies weren't bodies, they were vehicles. Death wasn't death, it was exiting the vehicle. The earth wasn't home, it was a temporary classroom. Marshall Applewhite wasn't simply a leader. He was dough. Bonnie was tea. When you create a new language, you slowly create a new reality. And the more someone speaks that language every day, the more natural that reality begins to feel. And that wasn't something that happened overnight. It happened through hundreds of small choices. Every sacrifice reinforced the last one. Every commitment made the next commitment easier. Every day inside the group made the outside world feel a little more distant. By the mid-1990s, many members had spent years, even decades, living this way. For them, Heaven's Gate wasn't just something they believed, it was who they were. And once a belief becomes part of your identity, walking away no longer feels like changing your mind. It feels like losing yourself. That idea is one of the most powerful forces in all of human psychology. Because once our identity is involved, logic alone rarely changes us. This is where I think many people make the biggest mistake when they hear stories like Heaven's Gate. They assume the followers were manipulated because they weren't intelligent. But intelligence isn't what protects us from these situations. Psychology tells us something much more uncomfortable. The very same mental processes that help us build relationships, stay committed to our goals, and find communities are the same processes that, under the wrong circumstances, can pull us somewhere dangerous. Let's start with something called foot in the door effect. Imagine I ask you to donate $1 to a charity. That doesn't feel like a big commitment, right? Now imagine that a week later, I ask you if you could volunteer for an hour. Because you've already said yes once, saying yes again feels easier. And then I ask you to volunteer every Saturday. And then I ask you to become a board member. Each request builds on the last. You rarely notice how far you've come because no single step feels dramatic. Joining Heaven's Gate worked in much of the same way. No one was recruited with the promise of group suicide. They were invited to a conversation, and then another, and then a meeting, and then a weekend, and then a deeper commitment. Each step felt like a natural continuation of the one before it. Psychologists call this commitment and consistency. Once we've publicly committed to something, our brains naturally want our future actions to stay consistent with our past decisions. Not because we're irrational, but because consistency feels psychologically comfortable. Changing our minds can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. And that's where another concept enters the picture: cognitive dissonance, which we've talked about before. It's that mental discomfort we experience when our beliefs and our actions don't line up. Imagine you've given away your possessions, you've left your family, you've dedicated years of your life to a movement. If doubts begin to creep in, your brain has two options. One, accept that you've made a terrible mistake, or two, become even more convinced that you made the right decision. Ironically, the second option is often much easier. Not because people are foolish, but because admitting we've built our lives around something false is incredibly painful. And then there's social proof. Human beings constantly look to the people around us to figure out what's normal. If everyone in your community believes something, if everyone you trust repeats it, if everyone seems calm and confident, that belief begins to feel safer, more reasonable. Even when someone has private doubts, they often stay silent because everyone else appears certain. Psychologists call this pluralistic ignorance. Many people privately question something while assuming they're the only one, so no one speaks up. And because no one speaks, everyone believes everyone else is completely convinced. And then finally, there's identity. By the time someone has spent years inside Heaven's Gate, leaving wasn't just walking away from a belief. It meant losing their friends, their purpose, their daily routine, their future, their entire understanding of who they were. That's an almost impossible decision for any human being because our brains aren't just wired to seek truth, they're also wired to seek belonging. And sometimes belonging wins. When we hear stories like Heaven's Gate, it's tempting to ask, how could they believe that? But a better question might actually be, what psychological forces were quietly shaping every decision that they made? Because those same forces are still shaping ours today, just in a very different way. By the mid-1990s, Heaven's Gate had existed for more than 20 years. Some followers had spent decades building their lives around the group's teachings. They had left behind their careers, families, relationships, their entire identities. Everything they had sacrificed pointed towards one promise: the next level. Then, in 1995, astronomers discovered a comet that would soon become visible across the world. Its name was the Hale Bopp. And as excitement grew among scientists and amateur astronomers, rumors also began to spread. One claim suggested that a mysterious object was traveling behind the comet. Some believed that it was a spacecraft. The claim was quickly dismissed by astronomers after better observation showed no such objects existed. But by then, the rumor had already taken on a life of its own. For Marshall Applewhite, it wasn't just a rumor, it was confirmation. He became convinced that the spacecraft hidden behind Hale Bopp had come from them, that this wasn't the end of the world. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Everything they had believed over 2 decades suddenly felt validated. The group began making final preparations, not for death, but for departure. Members recorded farewell messages, and if you've never watched them, they are striking. Not because people appeared frightened, but because they don't. Many of them smile, they laugh, and speak with excitement. They thank Marshall Applewhite for helping them find the truth. Several described themselves as happy, peaceful, even grateful. Watching those videos can be very unsettling, not because you see panic, but because you see the certainty. On the surface, it seems impossible. How could someone calmly record a goodbye video before ending their own life? But if you remember everything we've talked about today, it begins to make more sense. If you genuinely believe your body is only a temporary vehicle, if you believe you're about to join a higher level of existence, if everyone around you shares that belief, then what looks like a tragedy to an outsider can actually feel like a graduation to an insider. Over the course of several days in March of 1997, the members carried out their final plan. They died in 3 groups. Each group helped prepare the next. After taking a mixture of phenobarbital and alcohol, members placed plastic bags over their heads to ensure death would occur. Those who remained alive carefully covered each person's face with a purple cloth before moving on to help the next group. It was organized, deliberate, and heartbreakingly calm. When authorities entered the rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe on March 26, 1997, they found 39 people who believed they had completed the final step of their journey. Marshall Applewhite was amongst them. He was the last to die. News of the event spread around the world, and people searched for explanations. Most of us settled on a simple answer. They were crazy. But simple answers rarely explain complex human behavior. Because if insanity alone explained Heaven's Gate, there wouldn't have been decades of trust, years of friendship, daily routines, shared meals, sacrifices, hope, purpose, or love. The final days of Heaven's Gate didn't begin in March of 1997. They began with small decisions made years earlier. Conversations, commitments, beliefs, each one leading quietly to the next. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Not because it happened all at once, but because it didn't. When most people hear the story of Heaven's Gate, they ask one question: how could they do that? It's a completely understandable reaction, but I don't think it's the most interesting question. I think the better question is, what does this story teach us about being human? Because while most of us will never join a cult, every single one of us is influenced by the same psychological forces that shaped Heaven's Gate. We all want certainty. We all want to belong. We all want our lives to have some meaning. Those aren't weaknesses. They're some of the most deeply human needs we have. The problem isn't that we have those needs. The problem is that those needs can sometimes outweigh our willingness to question what we believe. Think about social media. How often do we surround ourselves with people who already agree with us? That algorithms notice what we engage with. Then they show us more of it. Before long, it can feel like everyone thinks the same way we do. And that's not so different from living inside any other echo chamber. Think about conspiracy theories. People rarely believe them because they're trying to reject reality. Many are trying to make sense of a confusing world, A complicated world becomes much less frightening when someone offers a simple explanation. Think about an abusive relationship. Friends often ask, why didn't they just leave? But by the time someone realizes that they're in an unhealthy relationship, they may have spent years become emotionally, financially, and psychologically invested. Leaving isn't just walking away from another person. It's walking away from the future they imagined. Think about high-pressure workplaces, organizations where questioning leadership is quietly discouraged, where loyalty is rewarded more than curiosity, where your identity slowly becomes tied to your job. Or think about fitness communities, political movements, online groups, religious organizations, even fan communities. Most of these aren't harmful. In fact, many are incredibly positive. The point isn't that every close-knit group is dangerous. The point is that every group influences us. And the healthier the group, the more it welcomes questions, the more it allows disagreement, the more it encourages people to think for themselves. Healthy communities don't fear curiosity, they depend on it. And that's one of the biggest lessons Heaven's Gate leaves us with. Curiosity isn't the opposite of commitment. It's the safeguard against blind commitment. Psychology doesn't tell us that we're doomed to repeat history. It tells us that understanding these patterns gives us a better chance of recognizing them, not just in other people, but in ourselves. Because the moment that we believe, I could never fall for something like that, is often the moment we stop paying attention to the psychological forces that influence all of us. The story of Heaven's Gate isn't really about aliens or comets or spaceships. It's really about something much closer to home. It's about the incredible human desire to belong, to matter, to find certainty in an uncertain world. And maybe that's why this story continues to fascinate us nearly 30 years later. Not because it's so different from us, but because in some uncomfortable ways, it isn't. Before you move on with your day, I want to leave you with something to think about. Is there a belief you've held for a long time simply because you've never stopped to question it? Maybe it's something that you learned growing up, or something your social circle believes. Maybe it's something you've repeated so many times that it just simply feels true. This week, I want to challenge you to get curious, not cynical, not argumentative, curious. Ask yourself, how did I come to believe this? Who influenced that belief? If I had grown up somewhere else, would I still think the same way? Those questions aren't signs of weaknesses. They're signs of intellectual humility. And they may be some of the most powerful questions we can ever ask ourselves. If you've enjoyed today's episode and you're curious about the psychology behind why people do what they do, I'd love to have you here each week. So take a second to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you have a moment, leaving a rating or a review really helps more curious minds discover the show. Thank you so much for spending part of your day with me. Until next time, stay curious, question the pattern, and I'll see you in the next episode.